Welcome to Lesson 3, the impact of the peace treaty on Germany to 1923. This lesson will cover a lot of things that will actually probably triple cover in your GCSE. We'll look at some of the impacts of the peace treaty and the situations and goings on in Germany when we look at the depth study of Germany 1919 to 1945. And additionally, when we talk about sort of the rise of the Nazis and the start of World War II, you can't help but avoid some of the impacts of the peace treaty on Germany. Now, there's quite a bit of debate about whether or not the peace settlement imposed on Germany was too harsh or not. Initially, and for a long time, theory put forth by the British economist John Maynard Keynes seems to have ruled that the treaty itself was too harsh, that the treaty set the table for World War II. It was a Carthaginian peace, referring to the Roman siege and sacking of the city of Carthage, which effectively eradicated the Carthaginians and destroyed them as an entity for all time. Other people have contributed to that, and there's been a great deal of scholarship in the last 30 years about whether or not the peace treaty was harsh. And I think now it's time to make a more nuanced viewpoint. In fact, part of GCSE is you're going to have to take an opinion on this, and you're going to have to understand what the arguments are and have one of your own, not necessarily original, but you're going to have to agree with one of the schools of thought. And another one of the schools of thought that have challenged this conventional idea is the notion that had Germany won the war, they probably would have imposed a settlement far harsher than the Treaty of Versailles on the Allies, French and the British, etc. The best example to prove this theory is the fact that the Germans had punitively punished the Russians when the Russians surrendered in 1917 and finally signed a peace treaty in early 1918. The peace treaty that ended the war on the Eastern Front in 1918 between the Russians and the Germans was known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And this treaty took huge tracts of Russia away, a lot of their industry, significant portions of their land, about a third of their population. And most people saw this as evidence of the type of peace the Germans would have imposed. And there's lots of evidence for this. The Germans had and were led by extreme nationalists who believed in this concept known as Siegfried, which meant peace with total annexation of Europe. So a peace that would assure that Germany dominates Europe from the end of the war for the foreseeable future. The other side of that argument tended to be taken by sort of the more liberal historians who look at what happened, particularly in the view of the Nazis rising to power on the backs of things like, their anger over the peace treaty. And they say that Germany was being double punished. Number one, they lost the war and they had to pay reparations. And to pay these reparations, they had taken away from them in the peace treaty many of the resources needed to pay the reparations that they were required to pay. So in many ways, it was a double punishment. The debate still rages. Now, in Germany, and we have to start there, it's important to know what was felt at the time. To many Germans, not all, but I would say significantly more than half, the Versailles Treaty was a humiliating diktat. A diktat is a German word, means something told to you, dictated without negotiations. The Germans were not invited to the peace discussions whatsoever. They saw this peace as shameful. They saw the politicians who signed the treaty as criminals. They called them the November criminals, or the people who stabbed Germany in the back. And they believed that anybody who signed it was an enemy of the state. The extent Germany was involved at all in this treaty was just briefly before they were forced to sign it. They were shown the treaty and they were allowed to express their concerns in writing. And at most, this led to tiny, small changes. For instance, they agreed to, the Allies agreed to allow a plebiscite in an area known as Upper Silesia, whether or not they wanted to remain part of Germany or be governed by the League of Nations. One, it's very important to note that why did they sign the treaty? Well, I always feel bad, and I think you have to realize that the politicians didn't like the treaty, nor did they want to sign it. However, there was little choice. The Allies would have invaded Germany, the war would have continued, and the German army was in total collapse. It could not and did not have the means to resist this invasion, and therefore, with its people starving, had to sign the treaty. The most controversial clause, and probably one of the worst ones, is worst ones in the eyes of the Germans anyway, was Article 238. This was the clause that gave Germany war guilt, the idea that they had to accept that they were responsible for the war and its consequences. The lawyers of the Allies made sure that this piece of the treaty was in there, and as I've said before, the primary reason is it gave legal justification for charging them money for starting the war. Germans felt that this clause especially rubbed salt in their wounds. They felt that actually most Germans went to war. The overwhelming conception of the war in Germany in 1914, rightly or wrongly, amongst the people, was that they were going to war to defend their homeland, which was being threatened by an alliance of Russia, France, and Great Britain. They were not convinced that they were alone responsible for the war. Of course, they have very good reason for that. Don't forget, the war starts between the Austro-Hungarians and the Serbians, and the Russians are the first major power to mobilize their army. And actually, the Russians declare war before the Germans do. So therefore, there is legitimate reason for this. The cartoon on the right is from a German right-wing magazine, a very harsh anti-Semitic right-wing magazine that was popular at the time called Simplicissimus. And this one very much shows the three-peace treaty, big three rather, three peace treaty negotiators of France, Britain, and the United States about to, symbolically chop the head off with the guillotine of the German people. Article 238 would prove massively controversial, and of course this would be a central point in politics in Germany, as people say we must reverse this diktat, this humiliating peace treaty, we didn't start the war, etc., etc. The Nazis would pick up on it, but it's a very important point. The political impact of this was traumatic, of course, with most Germans believing that they didn't start the war. Germany ends up in an incredibly tumultuous situation. You have a government that's sort of created at the last minute. The Kaiser steps down only days before the war ends, and Germany becomes a republic. Now, the instability of Germany at the end of the war gives every person with a political means on both the left and the right of the political spectrum to try and push forth a new Germany, or this bottom line is it makes Germany ripe for revolution. The democratic system known as the Weimar Republic that's set up, and it's actually very symbolic that it's called the Weimar Republic. Berlin, the capital, is so unstable and so revolutionary that the Democrats, who are negotiating a new government for Germany in the last days of the war, can't even meet in Berlin for fear of their own lives. And they go to the southern German small city of Weimar, and it's where they negotiate how the German government is going to look. And it ends up being called the Weimar Republic as a consequence of that. But it's also sort of telling in the fact that this was a government started in a city of very little importance, because Berlin, the capital, was so politically unstable that they couldn't actually even be there. The people of the Weimar Republic had very little option but to sign the treaty, and the Weimar Republic's government had to bear the consequences of signing something so enormously unpopular amongst the German people, and something that in many cases the Germans would not forgive them for. The political impacts on Germany continue to resonate from the actual signing, of course. It undermines the authority and credibility of this new republic, the very essence signing this treaty. Number one, right-wing politicians, activist groups will attempt to overthrow the government on several occasions. The most notable are the Kapp Putsch, in which, for a series of a few days, a number of paramilitary units led by a doctor, a military leader, a guy named Wolfgang Kapp, and his partner Karl Lutwitz, supported by members of the German army, try to overthrow the government and actually successfully do. The government flees for a short period of time, but is eventually brought down by a general strike. Effectively, the workers won't cooperate with this new government, and they end up running away to Sweden. Of course, there's the famous Munich or Beer Hall Putsch, where Hitler tries to overthrow the government of Bavaria in 1923. These are just some examples of people on the right wing, groups on the right wing, trying to overthrow this unstable government. On the left, On the left, you have extremist groups trying to exploit the unpopularity of the government and set up a quasi-Russian-style communist government. In fact, for a period of time, Bavaria, the second largest German state, is dominated by a socialist government. There's the Rural Red Rebellion of 1920, where Germany's industrial areas see the workers rise up and try to overthrow their bosses and their leaders. Both of these are effectively crushed by the government with the help of the army. Now, right-wing extremists continue to be probably the biggest threat at this time. It becomes commonplace for right-wing extremists to commit acts of political assassination of high-ranking members of the German government, such as Matthias Erzberger, the finance minister, and Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister. There are 365 political assassinations of government officials in the Weimar Republic by right-wing assassins trying to destabilize a government which they detest for not only signing the treaty, but for being democratic. So what this effectively means is that signing the Treaty of Versailles was a massive disadvantage from the beginning. It deprives the government of much-needed support. Germans look towards other systems of government as a solution rather than work with this democracy. And it's really quite an interesting fact that the first German election after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which happens in 1919, sees democratic parties receive less than half of the votes in the Reichstag. More than half of the Germans who vote in that election are voting for parties whose express goal is to destroy the Weimar Republic. So the political impact of this is massively huge. There's a couple interesting points in the Kapp Putsch. As I sort of alluded to, the disbanding of the army by the Treaty of Versailles leads to the first right-wing rebellion. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles limits the German army to 100,000 people. Now, to meet that, you have to take a standing army of over 1 million people, and you have to basically fire them. And the ex-soldiers returning from war tended to be used by the government, at least in the first few months anyway, as a sort of a quasi-military police to try and keep order in a very chaotic situation. And when these people are disbanded, in other words, fired, they rise up, led by Wolfgang Kapp, and stage a coup in Berlin, which temporarily takes control of this government. The defense minister orders the army to act, but the army is like, no, we support these people. These people are soldiers. We will not fire on our own people. And the government ends up fleeing to the city of Dresden, as I alluded to. Now, there they call a general strike, and the workers don't support this right-wing government. They don't want to see the army taking over at this particular time. And after a short period of time, sort of Kapp's government collapses. The government returns in the Weimar Republic after a 4-day hiatus continues on. The economic impact on the other side of this is also incredibly important, and it's very, very severe. Germany, of course, was in dire economic straits to begin with. Of course, the First World War cost Germany everything it had. It borrowed substantial sums of money. It results to printing the money. And when Germany has the additional problem of reparations imposed upon it, the valuable resources that it would use to pay this are taken away, it leads to inflation. Germany has no choice but to print money in the post-war years. And when you print more money, you put more money in circulation. It's something I can explain in more detail if you'd like to understand how that works economically another time, that is. But the more money in circulation, the less value that money has. So the people who had savings in their banks see that the value of whatever money they had in the bank seems to effectively disappear. This leads to what's known as the crisis of 1923. Germany will pay its first couple installments of reparations, but by 1922 it claims it could not. It tries to fulfill the treaty, but by 1922 it starts defaulting on its loans. France, thinking Germany is bluffing, and trying to escape from their obligations, take direct action and occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial area, to seize the coal and other resources by force. The German government, horrified by the French occupation of the Ruhr, responds by ordering the German people into what they now call passive resistance, to basically not cooperate with the French. Don't work in the factories. Don't take the trams. don't listen to the French instructions, etc., etc. And what you have is the German people ignoring the French and not doing anything, and the French trying to get the German people to load the trains full of coal, for instance, but they won't do it. And the French respond with quite a good deal of severity, which of course does nothing but exacerbate the anger in the situation. They expel 100,000 people from the Ruhr, they kill 130 people who sort of protest. The German government actually has the double problem of, number one, because the Ruhr isn't producing anything, they're not getting any taxes because the people aren't working, because they're on strike. They're not getting any taxes, and as such, they have a refugee crisis. 100,000 people are being kicked out of the Ruhr, and these people have to be settled in other areas, which is incredibly expensive. They also have to, of course, feed these people, etc., etc. And this contributes heavily to German government debt. And soon, with inflation increasing, lack of tax-based debt going up, the German government is effectively in a situation which it can't control. Inflation, sort of the devaluation of money, already high because, of course, they printed money since the end of the war, leads to hyperinflation in 1923. The German money effectively loses all its value. The mark, the German dollar or pound, becomes worthless. The middle class lose all of their savings. So, you know, if you have 1,000 marks in the bank, for instance, and all of a sudden 1 mark is devalued to the point where 1 mark yesterday, in a week's time, it is 500 marks. What you have in the bank is valueless. It's just paper. And bartering becomes the system of the economy. People trade things rather than use money. Now, to give you an idea of how ridiculous the hyperinflation is, the Daily Mail, yes, the Daily Mail in England reports from Berlin at the time, and they say that prices in the shops are typewritten and posted hourly. For instance, a gramophone, sort of an early record player, at 10 a.m. is 5 million marks. At 3 p.m. it's 12 million marks. That gives you an idea of the extent of the runoff cost of hyperinflation. That Daily Mail, in which you wanted to read the price of the gramophone, cost 35,000 marks on the 29th of July. The next day, it nearly doubles in price to 60,000 marks. And for a paper of that quality, that's quite a lot of marks. Hey, some might say it's worth it. No comment. Moving forward, the stabilization of the currency. In August 1923, Germany is forced to take drastic action, and a government politician, a man named Gustav Stresemann, becomes chancellor. Stresemann had previously been the finance minister and actually will be government minister in many continuous governments. He's a very bright man. He's a man who, in many ways, at least at the time of the war, supported right-wing governments, but has a conversion to democracy. And that's not really here or there, but it's just an interesting point. He decides that he is going to save the Weimar Republic. And in September 1923, he takes 3 particular measures to stabilize the situation. Number 1, he starts repaying reparations. Okay? And in order to, when he says we will continue to repay these reparations, the French agree to study the problem of the German economy. Number 1, they say, okay, we will effectively end our occupation. We will, we'll study the problem of the German economy. We'll look at whether or not you can actually pay this total sum. He then cancels the old mark. He gets rid of the mark as the German currency and effectively creates a new currency and restarts. Okay, he threw out the baby with the bathwater and says, okay, the other currency is so valueless and so worthless, we'll never get it back. So we need to start over with a new currency. And he establishes a new currency called the Rentenmark, and this replaces the old mark. And to do so, he limits the printing of this money so that the money in circulation has value, to sort of stabilize the government finances. 700,000 state employees are fired in an attempt to balance the budget. He opens up a new central bank, and he puts a man in charge named Hjalmar Schacht as currency commissioner. Schacht himself is more or less an economic genius. He will later in life become very important in how Hitler turns the German economy around. But he oversees the replacement of the worthless currency with the Rentenmark and effectively stops the hyperinflation. So those are the major things. What also Stresemann is able to do over the next 5 or 6 years is negotiate two important treaties. The first one is the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan is sort of the fulfillment of the French agreement. Move your troops out. We will pay reparations, but let's discuss. And it's named after the American who sort of negotiated the deal between the French and the Germans, a man named Dawes. And the Dawes Plan makes the reparations payments more flexible. So in times of hardship, Germany can pay less. In times of success, they'll pay a bit more. And this sort of allows Germany to pay the reparations and at the same time have an economy that's to any degree functioning. In 1929, Stresemann will also negotiate what's known as the Young Plan, which will reduce the overall amount of reparations to £2 billion. The reparations issue causes a lot of bitterness, and it ultimately achieves very little. Germany took in more in American loans by 1928 than it will ever pay in reparations. So the fact that, you know, the money given to Germany by the Americans primarily will be far greater than the money that the Germans ever give to the French and the Belgians. And in fact, the reparations bill isn't really settled until 2010. The impact of disarmament is also important to look at. The dislike of these clauses were partly due to the loss of status and prestige, okay? Most Germans who objected to the concept of disarmament would say things like, you know, 100,000 people is insufficient for a safe border defense, that we're surrounded by hostile territories in the south, in, you know, Czechoslovakia, this new country, or in the east, Poland, and potentially the Russian Soviet Union, and very much to the left in the French. And 100,000 people is insufficient. They also claim that it's difficult to deal with revolts and uprisings. The German government has no means to protect itself against its internal enemies. So the impact of disarmament, for more than anything, is for a lot of people who believed in German greatness, they tended to associate, of course, German greatness with the German military power, and the humiliation of disarmament is something that weighed on them heavily. The other aspect that needs to be considered of the impact of the treaty is the notion that the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson were effectively ignored when it comes to Germany. The Germans, as I mentioned in the first lesson, maintained that they signed the armistice, and this is true, after speaking with Wilson, that the treaty that would follow would be based on his ideals of the 14 points. Now, Wilson had not consulted the French or the British when he made this agreement, and in many ways spoke out of turn, but nevertheless, it doesn't discount the fact that the Germans believed that the 14 points would be applied to them, and when they weren't in full anyhow, they saw this as a betrayal. The German people, in light of the 14 points, felt betrayed in a few ways. Number one, there's no mention of the 14 points of war guilt or reparations anywhere in the treaty. Okay, and of course, the idea of war guilt and reparations runs counter in many ways to the idealism of Woodrow Wilson. The 14 points promised disarmament for everyone. However, Germany and its allies, I suppose, are the only countries required to disarm, and this was not allowed in the League of Nations for the time. So the other major impact, of course, was the concept of self-determination. It was very clear that self-determination was meant for other countries, not necessarily the Germans, and they had a lot of reason to be upset about this. Of course, areas such as Alsace-Lorraine, at this point probably predominantly, well, I would say more than half German-speaking, was not given the sort of the option of deciding whether or not they would remain part of Germany. The Saar Basin had 15 years of control before it was to be able to decide its future. The Ruhr was the Rhineland was half occupied. Austria, Germany's closest neighbor, and of course, before the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up, but certainly afterwards, there was tremendous, overwhelming support in both countries for a unification of the two German-speaking countries of Austria and Germany. And of course, them being forbidden expressly in the Treaty of Versailles to unify is in many ways preventing them from deciding their own future, and a sort of a backtrack on the concept of self-determination. So the Allies, are accused of these things, and the idea that the 14 points were ignored in Germany's in the case of Germany, upset a lot of Germans. What's important to note is that the Allies at no circumstances never did really truly come out and promise, certainly not in writing, to follow them to the letter. But rather they said pretty uniformly that they would use the 14 points as their guiding principles in the treaty, which sort of allows them the wiggle room to get out of using them. And the other counter-argument to that is, though the Germans seem to focus on Austria, Alsace-Lorraine, and of course the Saar Basin, as we noted earlier in the lesson, the Germans were able to negotiate the use of self-determination in areas of Germany like Upper Silesia, which in a referendum or plebiscite voted to remain part of Germany because of the principle of self-determination, as did areas of East Prussia, especially around Danzig and Schleswig in the, I believe it's the southeast, all vote to remain part of Germany, and self-determination is partially applied. So the Germans aren't entirely correct saying that self-determination was denied us, at least in some aspects, at least the ones that were most concerning to the Allies, such as a unification of Germany and Austria, which would have created, again, a very strong Germany. Yes, of course, it was denied, but in other areas it was. So there's a little bit of a counter-argument to that. So you have to understand that, of course, when people are angry, and of course in all of these things, you tend to pick the things that agree with your side most without looking at the other side entirely. All that said, the impacts of the treaty on Germany are enormous and will cause problems later on, and it's your job to help evaluate whether or not this treaty was ultimately fair. That's it for this lesson. Bit of a long one. Hope you enjoyed.